3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you all for joining us this evening for June's monthly meeting entitled Grief and Loss, A Personal Experience by Natalie Jensen. Natalie has her master's degree in social work and is currently a supervisee at Sunstone Counseling, a local counseling service provider with office locations in Falls Church, Alexandria, McLean, and Ashburn. Natalie's a PESI certified clinical trauma professional, an active member of the National Association of Social Workers, and amongst her many focus areas in counseling is adult individuals who've experienced grief and loss, which is why she's here to speak with us today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items and plugs. Our biggest fundraiser of the year, Nami Walks Northern Virginia 2022, is going to be held on Saturday, October 8th at the Plaza Tyson's Corner Center. We're going to be hosting an info meeting for those who are interested in creating walk teams and who are interested in maybe just generally coming to the event. It's coming up on Thursday, July 7th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Again, that's an info meeting to talk with us about Nami Walks. It'll be at Ornery Tap House in Fairfax City, Virginia. We're also, another event we have coming up, we're starting up a Nami family class on July 6th. There's a few spots still available, so if you want to register for that class, you're going to want to do that ASAP. I'm going to put links with details about both of those items and events in the chat. We want to invite you all to engage with us throughout this presentation by posting any comments or questions down in the chat. I'm going to be compiling those questions and saving them to ask to Natalie at the end. We're going to do our best to address all the relevant questions that you all come up with. So again, please engage with us. Also, if you may, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. This really helps us get the word out about our future meetings and helps you find our content easier as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Natalie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, and especially to Nami, Northern Virginia. It is an honor to be with you today. It is not an easy topic, but as the title suggests, it's very personal, and I feel passionately about providing whatever resources and spaces and places for people to communicate about this difficult topic. I appreciate the introduction and the honor to be in your presence. I am sending out all kinds of compassion for each of you, wherever you are in your space. As was mentioned, I'm with Sunstone Counseling. A little bit more about my history. Some of my clinical internship was done working with those experiencing traumatic loss at a medical examiner's office and providing support to those families, as well as the responders who worked in those spaces. So in addition to that, both personally and professionally, I have experience, as we all do, with different kinds of loss, and I will reference some of that throughout this evening. The most important thing I hope you can remember and keep in mind is that you take good and gentle care of yourself and what you know to be right for you. So if you do notice that this topic, while intriguing or interesting, it can be difficult and it can be heavy. Listen to that. I just encourage, if you need to step away and take a drink of water, take a breath. I just want to encourage that, and I'll try to do some reminders about that throughout. I guess I will switch to sharing my screen. I also ask that you bear with me. I'm technically mostly savvy, but there might be some hiccups. So thank you in advance for your patience with me. Is there anything else, Lee, before I get started trying to switch gears to the presentation?
Nope, I think you're great. I just made you a host now, so you can you should be able to share your
great.
screen.
Cool. All right, then I will switch gears to that. Thank you for bearing with me, y'all. Okay. All right, I'm just double checking what you can see. I apologize. We're good. Okay.
may want to do present. Yeah.
Right.
But I can see the presentation. Yeah.
Is everything's good? Okay. Thank you. I would rather be meeting with you all in person, but I understand. So thank you for your patience. So grief and loss, a very personal experience, both for myself and probably for many of you. So the framework for today, I already did the introduction. We both provided some friendly reminders. And again, if there's some questions that come to mind or some topics that come to mind as we're talking or clarifications, please be in touch and interact. Lee is on that. We'll review some vocabulary and what some of my mentors talk about as signals. There'll be more about that. A little bit about some myths or misconceptions. Of course, given the relevance of this gathering and this meeting, mental health considerations, questions, and I've got a list of resources to follow up at the end. So, vocabulary. There's a lot of words that come to mind in this, and I just invite you to think as you take a breath and look at all the words on the page, or maybe just, I don't know, what did you think I meant by vocabulary around grief and loss? Some of the important things to keep in mind. There's a lot of different interpretations. There's a lot of people out there that have different ways of explaining their experience. I believe that grievers are the experts on their experience, meaning I can tell you a particular description, and maybe you have some other ideas. Again, that's part of what this community is about, is having those candid conversations, right? So grief being our internal thoughts and feelings, that's generally accepted by many people in the field and those who are grieving. But sometimes I've noticed that either society or the media or even our own family systems or friends might just put it all under one umbrella. And the fact is it's not necessarily described that way for those in the field and those who are grieving. So grief being our internal thoughts and feelings. Mourning, often an old-fashioned term or something that people say, we don't use that word anymore. But a lot of people like to encourage that it's the external expression of that internal thought or feeling. The mourning is actually an action, it's a verb. So if we just take those two words, those are a full person experience. The outward grief and action, meaning, for example, our internal thoughts and feelings, we're missing a person, a place, or a loss. We'll get to that later. We think about it, we might write about it, we might have our own private moments about it. The mourning is, not just a funeral, not just an expression or a ritual. Mourning is sometimes sharing a story, remembering that internal feeling and having an outward expression of it. It could be being in a walk. It could be honoring a loved one in that way or creating a foundation. It could be playing catch because that was something that you did with that person. And it is a way of putting that grief and that internal feeling into action. Ironically, another term that people sometimes call maybe old-fashioned, or it's kind of in the history books, not used a whole bunch by the everyday person, perhaps, bereavement. But translated, it means deprivation or loss by force, to feel robbed. Again, I think more people should probably be using some of these terms to describe what that experience is like, perhaps. Trauma, from the Greek word or root word for wound, rather than perhaps some people might say an injury, something you can see like a scrape or a twisted ankle. Some of our traumas, some of our griefs are wounds that are sometimes unseen. I mentioned a little bit about signals and symptoms. In the medical world, people use the word symptoms, and often in our everyday, people are like, okay, so are you running a temperature? Are you twisted the ankle? Is it swelling? Is it bruised? Is it hurting? Some of my mentors and what I know personally from loss, it can feel very pathologizing when you say, what's wrong with you? I'm grieving. As if it's going to have a set formula of symptoms that will lessen and they will go away for forever and never come back. The signals are a little different. A signal gives you attention, attunement. It can mean, hey, there's something that I need to pay attention to, and we actually lean more into that. So I prefer, you don't have to agree with me. In fact, I welcome dialogue about that, but it really takes away the pathology, because grief is a natural and understandably human experience. We just don't always get that message out in the world to us. So part of tonight, I hope to encourage that people begin to think about the language that they use. And we would all do probably a little better if we were a bit more understanding about that, of each other and ourselves. Some of these other terms I will certainly follow up about. There's a lot of different types of grief experiences. I actually just listened to a presentation today about somebody who lost their close relative at 12 years old. They're now 45, and they felt at one point that it was too late. They missed their chance at 12 years old to truly grieve and mourn their loved one. And I'm here to hopefully encourage that it is never too late. Your grief and your mourning and your pain, your bereavement are with you. And sometimes they're just unembarked. They don't get started in a way maybe it didn't feel safe to truly feel the range of feelings that can happen. And so sometimes we carry that grief. We avoid it because we are working on surviving, or we just recognize that, hey, it's not something that I want to spend time on. Well, the funny thing about it, and I share this from a personal perspective as well, is we can carry it, but it sure gets awful heavy at times when it's kind of pushed off to the side and never touched. Disenfranchised grief or loss. It's a big old word that sounds maybe confusing, but often that grief is an experience you have that maybe you were a child, maybe you were kind of brushed over in your experience. You're not allowed to fully express your experience and pain and missing and longing. It can also be found, disenfranchisement can also be found in the midst of stigma, particularly suicide, overdoses, some of our experiences that are currently happening in the world, where your grief is not deemed appropriate or okay by a certain group of people, including aspects of privilege and oppression. We can certainly delve more into that, but as I said, we're not going to get to every single thing tonight. And then there's the overwhelm, which we mostly know what that word is, but in relationship to grief, sometimes there are multiple losses. Sometimes there are losses in close proximity. Sometimes we have physical losses of people, and we have losses of stability or a sense of security. I'm sure you can create a list of some of those things. I will touch on more of that in a moment. Some of the words that people throw around are resilience, we resolve, we reconcile, or we integrate. Each of those words might have a different meaning for each of you. And sometimes we get the message from society that these are the end of the formula. These are what we should be looking for. From my own experience in grief and loss, I know that it's gotten different, but it has not resolved. I don't know that it ever will, which can be a really disheartening feeling sometimes. However, I believe, learned along the way some ways and methods to integrate it, to carry it in a different way, in a healthier way, hopefully. Another term from one of the many trainings and experiences I liked that the teachers used are living losses. These are not the death of a person. They are possibly a loss of sense of self or security, like I said, maybe hopes or dreams or plans, our expectations. And in this way, I would also say we all have experience with living losses, and how might we be a little more compassionate to ourselves and to each other, understanding that everybody we know experiences aspects of this particular experience. And again, I remind you about when you might hear somebody talk about grief and loss, it drives me a bit to the frustrated side when particularly providers use the word treat and symptoms. That is the medical model, and it presumes that X plus Y equals Z. And that is not what grievers report or I myself have experienced. If we're again translating the word, to treat is to drag, and patient is a long-term sufferer. So we're going to drag a long-term sufferer, and therefore somehow that's going to solve all the problems of this pain that is a human experience. I think everybody can probably guess where I stand on all that. I like to buck the system a little bit about that, but that's my own personal bias and opinion. So I know that was a lot of information. We'll kind of bounce back to some of this throughout the evening, and I want to give everybody a second. I know that was a lot of information. Related to signals, okay? I put the word potential up there, and there are 2 pages that we will cover, but if we use that idea of a signal, meaning it's giving us information that we should maybe pay attention to. Our body and our mind and our soul are trying to get our attention in the middle of grief, and it shows up physically, cognitively, emotionally. There are others, but I just wanted to kind of give us these are potentials. These are not guaranteed for everyone or every circumstance. But as you look over those, these are common experiences. Those who are experiencing grief and mourning, muscle tension, aches and pains, it physically shows up. We don't understand sometimes why it shows up that way. Maybe we understand it right as a loss happens, but it's not on a timeline. As much as the rest of the world gives us the message that it should be, well, it's a week now, it's a month now, some of these should be gone, right? That hasn't been my experience, and I would say all the people that I have walked alongside, they report these throughout, okay? I'm sure that's no new news to any of you. But often there's the assumption these should dissipate, these should not be present, especially things like what? Anger? Why do I feel guilty? I don't understand why I have increased preoccupation with the story of the loss, or I'm playing what ifs in my head. On the physical side, we might blame other things. And with all of these things that I'm talking about, I understand everybody has their own story of pre-existing circumstances. So this might take your muscle tension to the max. You might have more headaches. You might have an adjustment in your appetite, or you might increase that hypersensitivity or hypervigilance, indigestion, or dry mouth. Grief is hard. It's tiring. Your body and your mind and your soul are going through the ringer. I'm not encouraging that we stay in all of these places all the time, but I just wanted to give us a space to acknowledge, oh, some of these things might actually be in addition to what I already live with, but some of them can also show up in the middle of a loss experience or multiple. Another couple ways that affects us behaviorally and spiritually. Can't tell you how many times sometimes in my early experiences with grief personally, I'd forget why I ended up where I ended up. That's not the safest either, right? So it's ever important to be cognizant, especially when we're in that frame of mind, that we have some great supports around us. There could be a lack of hygiene or taking care of ourselves. We might be even more impulsive, or in our behavior shifts, we might put ourselves in even more dangerous situations. Even if we have been in long-term sobriety, it of course is something to be considerate of. It's something we should certainly be cognizant of, recognizing as with all things, in our time, they can affect. Spiritually, I don't particularly mean all religious circumstances, but for those that is an important thing. That's why I chose the term spiritual. For someone, it might be their practice or their belief system that has nothing to do with a higher power. But they still question why are these things happening? And that is understandably a human experience. It's potentially expected for us to search for the why, or to lose all aspect of faith in something, not necessarily a higher power. So I know that I listed those 5 categories, and I just invite, because I'm not engaging with you in person, right? Invite you to take a breath and do a check on yourself and see how you're doing. We just threw a bunch of information, and maybe it's prompted you to write something or take a note about something you've noticed. And I want to encourage that curiosity. Living with a grief experience takes great courage. And I believe that without even seeing each of you in a room. It takes great courage to have shown up tonight and to be willing to think about some of these things that the rest of the world sometimes rushes over. But it's a necessary thing to pay attention and tune into those signals. So here is a favorite illustration of mine. On my left is what I believe a lot of people are told is the process to get from point A to point B, to be done and over with your grief. And on the right-hand side is, in my opinion, an accurate description of what actually happens. It is not sequential. It is messy. And the society around us, or maybe our family system, maybe our coworkers, or maybe even the people closest to us might believe, well, I feel like it is this way from point A to point B. That shock, the numbness, the denial. We're going to talk in a moment about some of those misconceptions or the myths that, through no fault of our own, people tend to believe. And that's okay. The reason that people do is because in the midst, think about all of those signals, what's going on for us, body, mind, and soul. We're searching for making sense of something that doesn't feel like it makes any sense. So I can understand how people would say, well, I backslid, I went back to anger. I was already at hope and new patterns and new strengths. And my challenging self loves to be the little annoying voice, both from personal experience and professional experience, to say, I understand. That is something that can sometimes help us ground or feel like we have control over it. But what we actually understand is that there are new things happening for us in our grief journey all the time. And the example on the right might be a bit more accurate of what that feels like. That can be maybe scary for some to think about all of those squiggly lines and how that's confusing and not orderly. I feel for that. Somewhere in the middle, maybe we can figure out a way to find somewhere in the middle. That is my hope, and that is my encouragement. I do understand, I think, that part of it. So speaking of myths and misconceptions, the messages that we sometimes would have shared with us, I would invite you to take a moment, maybe even before looking at some of these things, and consider what people have said to you or what you might have said to other people. Again, you are doing your best. You're trying really, really hard to do your best to make sense of something that's very disorienting. What kind of things did people say, or have they said to you that maybe didn't set so right, or feel like it doesn't really match what you're feeling? The fact is, there's no perfect way. There's no perfect thing to say. And there's a lot of layers to everybody's experiences and why they may say something. Most people might believe some of these things or have firm grounding that that's just how it is. And I do respect that. But we've already covered that grief and mourning are not the same thing. That's not just me, that there's plenty of people who have done studies and real life interactions, right, with those who are grieving and mourning and can delineate those things. Grief and mourning progress in an orderly, predictable stage. A brief spot about that: Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a pioneer in the work of those grieving in the midst of death and dying. She worked with David Kessler on much work and books and all of that. She never intended for her stages, her 5 stages that are often used by media and sometimes our own trains of thought and family systems. She never intended that to be about those who are actively still here and grieving. She clarified that, and Kessler has written more about that. But that is what many of us have latched onto, or I certainly have noticed when something major happens in our world, people talk immediately about the stages. It's my hope that tonight, however many people are gathered here, will have a little bit more knowledge to share with their communities, and we might be able to adjust and change that. It was never her intention for that to be taken on that way. You should move away from grief and not toward it. We can try, and sometimes it's necessary to take a step back. The thing is that I don't know about you, but it happens to show up sometimes after I pushed it away long enough, and it really rears its head. So the opposite of that being, right? How can we in some way move toward it or allow it in, befriend it a little bit? If nothing else, in baby steps. And not all the time, but how can we do that? A little bit of a, I guess, picking it up from the buffet table, right? We don't take a whole big plate. We can take some from each bit of the food. Some of the other ones there, particularly that tears are signs of weakness, or that you should hurry up and get through it. Some of these, I'm sure, might be part of your everyday. But like I said earlier, I truly believe those who are feeling such bereavement and pain and feeling torn apart are have the opportunity to be some of the most courageous, tear-streaked, laughing, angry group of people. And yes, anger is a good and necessary thing sometimes. They are not a weakness. They in fact are, there's a physiological response that our body does when we have that release. And we also shouldn't shame if we don't see someone crying at the time we think that they should be crying. I would encourage compassion and understanding that not everybody will be crying at the same time or in the same way. You only grieve and mourn the physical absence of that person. I'm guessing you all probably know that's not true. There are certain habits that we form within our family or within our friend group or within our chosen group of associates or our coworkers. And we miss that regularity, that ability to expect that they're going to mow the lawn, or that they're going to, you could always count on them to pick up said groceries or your prescription while you took care of other things. That's an expectation that was usually happening. That is the person who's missing, but it's also about that sense of we had a rhythm. I knew I could count on that happening. Nobody can help you with your grief. I understand that nobody knows exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. I'm going to speak a little bit later about how we can all, in our own unique ways, be present to someone else's experience without putting our own on them, right? That can be offsetting. But perhaps it's not true that nobody can help you. Can people be present? Can people uphold and support you having your authentic grief and mourning experience? Yes, they can. And one of my favorites, I'm just hitting the highlights here, folks, is closure and finality. That word or those ideas, indeed, there are people who may feel that they have that sense of closure and ending. I subscribe to the idea that it is transformative to be in loss and grief. And when we are transformed, that is an ever constant process. Yes, there are certain things. My loved one is not coming back That is the reality. They are not coming back. But will you continue to miss and long for them? Will you continue to wrestle with a complicated relationship that you had with them? Possibly. So I would just encourage that this is not an all-inclusive list. And as you take a moment to look over that and maybe have written some of your own, thinking about either things you have contributed and said to others in a sense of trying to find your way and support somebody, and how it may or may not have been helpful. And maybe some of the things that have contributed to your heartache that have been said to you. Hurry up, right? You're still thinking about that person that way. It's been 5 years. It's been 7 months. It's been 1,836 days. Pick one, and probably somebody has said something to you. And I am so sorry if it was indeed some things that felt incredibly hurtful. I hope that, again, tonight can be about turning over a different way. And our group can make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of those we walk beside. So we talked about the signals, and we talked about vocabulary. We've also talked about some of the myths and misconceptions. I could spend a lot of time on each of these as well, but there are some factors that can contribute to some different aspects of grief and loss. I will explain a little bit of each of those. And again, some of these might also prompt further discussion. So I understand that I work with adults, but I also have been and worked with youth and teens, children, older adults. So it's always important to understand that loss is dysregulating and disruptive, and it's just like that picture where there's lines all over the place, and then there's all these other elements right here. So depending on what someone's abilities may be, where they are, age and stage in life, what those kind of considerations are, it might add some extra need for understanding and compassion and resources, because all people, all hearts, I truly want to stress this, all souls who are experiencing grief and loss and pain should have the ability and freedom to have their experience. One of the things that also can add to your experience, depending on your own personal history with substance use, any kind of trauma, multiple traumas, whether it was from childhood, during your middle adulthood, or what's currently going on, the nature of the type of loss you experienced. These can add complex factors that certainly need kind and compassionate attention and supports. Of course, everybody who has a social system, whether it's your chosen family, your biological family, an adopted family, whatever definition you have in your life, that can affect what your experience may be. Your relationship history. Not necessarily always and only with the person who is deceased. How about the good old family dynamics? And everybody kind of paints the picture of, well, they're grieving and family upheaval. And well, that can be true too. But there can be a lot of factors that tie into your experience that you might not even register in the moment, but have continual effects as yes, you mark that acute part of losing somebody. And then why am I now experiencing flashbacks, or I'm relating to people in my family system or this friend group, but it feels like when I was 15 or when this major event also happened. I'm replaying that. Why is that all happening? Why is this past loss coming up? I'm missing my dad. I just lost my dad, but why 15 years ago when I lost my mom, and it was not the same way I lost my dad, but why am I experiencing that too on top of it? So those are considerations. And with, again, compassionate supports and understanding, maybe even qualified mental health people who have experience with all of these considerations, some of that can be unpacked in a different way. Of course, the type or the manner of death can be a major factor. I always encourage people to not be comparative. We do it, we're human. It shouldn't be that way, but we do that, we're human. So when I say anticipatory, I'm talking about chronic or long-term illnesses, including cancer, but there might be others that are long-term physical or developmental needs, and someone knows that the life expectancy of a person is not going to make it to old age. Sometimes there can be complicating factors. There can be, again, tied to some of these other boxes and other subject matter. There can be complex factors. You could be involved in the legal system because of the manner of the death. That makes things even more complicated and heavy, difficult, and the sudden unexpected nature of a death, the shock and the trauma, even when somebody is comparative, any of those aspects can add an extra layer of pain and complexity, and again is greatly in need of kindness and compassion. Multiple losses, feeling like how many more things are going to come my way. Grief overwhelm, I use that term, and I think we can all recognize that the last 2 years, contributing factors of living in a pandemic on top of losses related to the pandemic or not, are certainly things that can affect our mental health and our ability to grieve and mourn in a healthier way. I mentioned disenfranchisement and talked about overdoses, suicide. I would also mention aspects of, anybody who has been pushed aside or not allowed to grieve in a way where their pain and their loss is seen as valid. That's what I mean by disenfranchisement. Of course, children, young adults, teens, older adults, aging adults. Each of those aspects of someone's life will affect their experience and their mental health. You may be sitting there saying, yeah, that's kind of obvious. But I guess I just wanted to highlight it to recognize the complexity of our own experience and that of those we may love or care for or want to support as someone grieving. Of course, culture or aspects of ritual and spirituality. It doesn't necessarily, again, mean any particular religious attribute, but it can. There are so many aspects of our world where we may not have a particular way that we do something, but there are also aspects that kind of rise in the middle of grief and loss that maybe we don't do on a regular basis, but it becomes part of someone has died. I need to walk through these aspects of ritual. It feels uncomfortable. There could be great harm that has come from any one of these concepts, in addition. And lastly, I could add more, I bet you could too, aspects of identity and intersections of our identities, whether it's race or gender expression, or how you have been treated, like I alluded to earlier, how you have been treated or how your family system has treated you. Those aspects can be incredibly sensitive, yes, especially at the acute phase of feeling loss, but they continue on the journey with us as they do in all other aspects of life as well. So again, I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to take a quick sip of water. I know I've been talking a lot, and I hope that there's been something that's been helpful for people. I'm going to check in with Lee just to see what's going on over there.
Yeah, no, you're doing great. Yeah, feel free. Take a pause. It's a lot of content. No questions as of now. So whenever you're ready, you can continue.
All right, so what can we do with all of this information and all of the things that we might be experiencing for ourselves? Given all the things that I've covered, it's a definitive need for an increase in supports, right? That doesn't always mean the people in your immediate circle at that particular time. As an example, sometimes there's the desire to protect children or those who appear to be more vulnerable from some of this pain, some of this mourning and grief. However, they can and should be active participants, obviously, developmentally appropriate. But it often is, I've observed that people sometimes feel they all have to like circle the wagons, keep it inside, keep it into their particular group. But especially when things have just happened or just occurred in those early days and months, the people on the innermost circle will have probably the least amount of energies, ability to be compassionate and simply holding a space. So it might actually be people that are kind of further removed that can serve in that capacity at that moment in time. It doesn't mean that you can't grieve as a family. That's not what I'm talking about. The aspect of grieving and mourning, we can do one. We can even maybe do a little bit of the dance, or what I call evading and encountering. It's a little bit of trial and error. What those things mean, sometimes we absolutely need to not experience our grief and loss. Sometimes we need to be doing something else. Sometimes we need to be taking a walk. Sometimes we need to be paying attention to the road and driving. Sometimes we need to be paying attention to taking our prescribed medications. Sometimes we need to take a sip of water or have a good laugh. The idea between the and is that we grieve and mourn. We have a little bit of leaning in and stepping out. It is trial and error to kind of figure out what works in the moment. But the encouragement is that we need to be able to access each of those things And the only way we can do that is by trying to do that trial and error. Okay, today I'm gonna make sure that I read something or listen to a piece of music that reminds me of my connection to that person. That's a personal internal process. That's the grieving. Maybe the next day or the next moment you decide, I'm going to the gym, or I'm going to watch a really fun show that I really like, and I'm not going to think about it. I've stepped out, I've stepped away, and I've made time to evade for a while. And then, maybe the next day, my active morning process could be, I'm going to share a story, or someone shared a story with me, and that made me think about something that I really enjoyed and I really miss. And I might even cry and laugh at the same time. That action of sharing my internal process, I moved it outside of myself. I'm actively mourning, I'm sharing it and expressing it with another. That's kind of those two things as some brief examples. And of course, in all things, I want to be an advocate for your mind and your body, recognizing the hierarchy of needs. So grief and mourning are hard work. I do understand that. It takes its toll. Think about those signals. It takes its toll. So we often need to really hone in on going back to the basics. Am I trying to get some sleep? Even if it's a 20-minute power nap, because often there's insomnia. Often we wake up anxious. Often we might spend some of the morning in a more lower mood or depressed mood. Did I get out and take a walk? Did I move my body? Am I paying attention to making sure I hydrate? Whether you're crying or not, we're working at a very highly stressed level sometimes when we grieve and mourn. So the simple things actually become some of the most important things for sustaining our ability to grieve and mourn in a healthy way. Recognizing again that we don't all grieve and mourn the same. I tell you what, I know it sounds fairly straightforward, but I hope we can listen to those words and actually take them to heart. Remembering that there are going to be people that feel the need to do. They might go back to work fairly soon. They might feel the need to start a foundation. They might feel the need to be doing things. Okay. And what studies have researched and grievers have shared is that there's a place for that. As long as, again, we're not doing all one thing and not the other. That's more aspect, related to the third one up from the bottom, right? The two different types of grieving. A particular train of thought and researcher labeled it intuitive and instrumental grieving. Sometimes there's the pressure from people, like, you should be crying, you should be expressing, you should be, I don't see that from you. And that instrumental griever might feel that is helpful to them, but they also maybe force that on other people. Again, this is about raising awareness. This is about remembering that those things are going to be unique to you, and you might do both at the same time. Those are some aspects to keep in mind. And finally, it may sound very cliche to say, remembering that it's a journey versus a destination. But again, our society loves to believe in outcomes and what do we got to show for it. And That's a lot of pressure. And I would again say, both personally and professionally, that hasn't been my experience, nor that of those who I've walked with. Recognizing that we are in this in a way for the long haul. That can be disconcerting, but my encouragement tonight is that maybe as we are gathered, that might change, at least in our circles tonight, or be the seed that gets planted for a change. I mentioned early on in the presentation about companioning and walking with and being with people. Whether you're a person who's in mental health like I am, or you're simply a concerned friend or loved one, or you are the person who's searching for someone to bear witness and be with you and walk with you, kind of through the ups and the downs. I have an example that I'm going to show of one way that, and I want you to hopefully pay attention to different things that these two people do. And the ironic part is there's not a lot of words. It's actually a very strong act and a lot going on, but there's not a lot of words. So this scene is from the show This Is Us, which, if you have not watched it, is a show that does a lot of flashbacks. There are lots of loss circumstances. As a warning for anyone watching, if you haven't watched it, one character has lost their mother, and the other person is the spouse to that person. And they're recognizing and wrestling with the fact that they are in their opinion, they no longer have a mother, and what that feels like for them. So this example is simply to show an aspect of one way to be present to someone, whether you're the griever or the person walking with them. And again, I apologize. I hope technologically everything works. We'll bear with it and hope it happens. Here we go.
I don't have a mom anymore.
Before we get moving into this area, one of the things that I appreciate about that clip is that, and I also give the disclaimer, not everybody feels comfortable with a hug, but the idea behind sharing that scene is that she didn't try to fix it. There's nothing she actually could say to change or shift his experience, but she simply was there. So whether you reach in for hugs or don't want them, the idea behind that, sharing that clip, is that she didn't have a particular word to say, and it would have been okay if she said, I don't know what to say. But then she didn't throw any of those misconceptions out there about it's going to be fine and she's with you. And sometimes those things can be incredibly, we feel like helpless that we can't help someone, but it also takes away some of that authentic grief and mourning that can be sometimes without words, by simply being present and letting someone know that you are with them, even if you don't have all the answers. And you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to. So I have a couple questions that I put up. I wanted to offer them to you, and hopefully, whether you're alone watching, or maybe if you are sitting and watching with someone else, there might be some interesting dialogue that comes up around these or things that you had. So I'm following up and checking back in. What are you already doing? Right? What are you already doing? Are there things that are helpful for you that you already know? You have that self-awareness? I would encourage you to honor those. And sometimes we don't slow down enough to honor what we already know is helpful for us. Given the deluge of information that I just put out there, where or how might there be need to seek further supports, or how might you try something different than what's been expected of you? And how has any idea or even keyword that's been shared, how might that look on your current losses or past losses? How might those be different? Okay. As you think about these, I'm going to move forward a few slides that are, because I'm have one more thing that I wanted to share with you. Whether you're helping someone or you wish that someone was helping you, I love this video, and I hope that people share it widely with your circles if it resonates with you. Megan Devine does work in mental health, but she also is an author, and she has all kinds of resources. She participated with a group of people as well in a PBS special that was called Speaking Grief. I forgot to put that on the list, but I will add it to my list. All different kinds. They spent an amazing amount of time interviewing real life people about their grief experiences, different kinds of loss. And she's a great thinker as well, philosopher, if you will. But I'll share this and then pause.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is. He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them. Or, you know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off. Or, I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture? We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
My friends, my hope is that something has sparked for you to know that there is support out there. And that would be one of the greatest things on my list of to-dos and what do I do is seeking and finding appropriate for you supports. And sometimes that is lifelong for sure. So that is my parting wish and hope for each of you. And I'm cognizant of time and want to be respectful of if there are questions, or if not, that's okay. I have some time. So.
Well, Natalie, thank you so much for presenting. I know, like, for me personally, a lot of the topics you touched on today really resonated with me. I felt like I learned a whole lot about supporting myself and supporting those around me, my community, family, friends, whomever. So I'm thankful for that. I did put a call out to folks in the chat and invited them to ask questions. It's been a pretty quiet group up to this point, but we will sort of allow some time, a few minutes here for folks to get their questions in if they do feel so inclined to, just to kick things off and maybe get some of those juices flowing. I do have a couple questions of my own. I'll just watching that video at the end there was really, really similar, like reminiscent, reminded me of that Brene Brown video done on empathy that we actually utilize in one of our presentations called Nami Ending Silence. Little plug there. But I think, it's, it stuck out to me in that it's so true that that's what people want a lot of the time, is that recognition, that, just sort of flat understanding of their situation. But it seems to be so counterintuitive to human nature. Like it feels like an unnatural response to someone struggling, to simply just acknowledge that. And I don't know if it's a cultural thing, so maybe this is more me asking for your opinion, but like, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think, when there are a lot of these pieces of media out there that on a large scale to the public sort of plead with everyone to just simply acknowledge, to show empathy. So like, why do you think that is? Why does that feel so counterintuitive, and what can be done that hasn't already been done? I don't know if that's too big of a question, but maybe just asking for your opinion, what you think.
Yeah, I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers ever. We are, especially in the Western world, a very death avoidant, pain avoidant, and it's understandably so. Like you said, human nature, we don't want people to be in pain, but it is actually a necessary experience for our system. It is I know it feels a lot of different ways, including stressful on our body physically as well. But there are so many other aspects that are for the positive that can be helpful in enriching our experience. And I know I'm not saying that your loss enriches your life and you should be seeking that out. But because we have kind of, it's not every culture. I will say that we are a unique part of the globe in particular that, we're all going to live to 100, and we're all going to have like these big muscles, and we're all going to look a certain way. And that is a cultural thing for the Western world, that it is very much about those outcomes. So that isn't how the world has operated. And there are many cultures in this world, on this planet today, that do not look at life from that perspective. So I in my own journey, this is my opinion. I did some exploring, particularly about the relationship between how much we celebrate births and how, well, in the Western world, and how we look at death and dying incredibly different than obviously many cultures or belief systems. They actually, I learned so much personally about how it, and I don't mean religious wise specifically, but this other like part of us, our spiritual side, I don't mean religious wise particularly. Our world has a lot to it, and it's not just some of the things that, we've been kind of trained, literally trained to believe, define what a good life is. I think about Viktor Frankl and all that he lived through in Man's Search for Meaning, and the horrific things that he experienced, and he still had aspects of hope and teaches us the multifaceted aspect of life, not just being the pursuit of happiness, not just being happy and joyful. And I think that avoidance of the uncomfortable and the discomfort leaves out a full person perspective. I think that's also the artist in me. I work in the arts as well, and we experience the gamut. We're about leaning into like all aspects of the human experience. They become more familiar if we befriend them rather than shun them and keep them in some corner. And actually, a more recent example is a clip of, it was on a late night talk show host, and I apologize, I'm not up on the actor I think he's the newest Spider-Man or something, and he had just lost his mother, and he talked about the talk show host asked him to speak of his grief about his mother, and he said, "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak of that extension of my love that is also grief." He said it far more eloquently. I can include that clip when I send follow-up stuff. Sorry, I just went on a tangent, but yeah. So.
And he's got such a nice little accent too. So yeah. So we still don't have any questions. We did get a couple comments though. Ileana, sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, said, "Thanks so much for so many ideas to use when we find ourselves in the situation to help someone else with their loss." Another person mentioned they agreed that the acknowledgement video that you shared was very helpful because their natural impulse is to try and fix it. Which, yeah, I don't know, that this cultural component is really kind of sticking with me at the moment. And, you talked about that actor, sort of thanking someone for allowing him to sort of explore the love for a lost one, in the midst of grief. I think there, you touched on kind of the individualistic nature of grief and all the different shapes and forms that it can manifest, which kind of, in our work, in Nami's work, dealing with mental health and working with people with mental health conditions and family members, we talk a lot about stigma, a lot about the stigma associated with people living with mental health conditions, about stigma associated with individual disorders and illnesses, about different treatments, and with grief, it feels like just as big of an issue, right? There's you can imagine, what is glamorized in Hollywood is the person who incurs some type of tragedy and then turns the page and does something great. I don't know, do you have anything to add about like stigma associated with grief and how that can be difficult for someone to navigate?
Yeah, it definitely makes it harder than it needs to be, and actually kind of takes away the opportunity, like you said, to be, well, you use the word individualistic. I think the dance is is knowing yourself and your own experience, and then what does my grief look like in community as well. And I think that that's where stigma can be a barrier, of course, because depending on the type of loss, which is why I shared a lot of resources that kind of cross the spectrum, because when you have that as a factor, it kind of stunts some of the natural progression that would be incredibly helpful. It makes it complicated grief. It makes it prolonged, which it's not lost on me that there's a whole other, that could be a whole other conversation, is the pathologizing of signals versus symptoms. And I understand, like, there are criteria and there are real things that people experience. I'm not saying they're not important, but when you pathologize things and you stigmatize things, grief can feel potentially very lonely anyway, and it adds to that. So I would say I wish I had all the answers, but I continue to hope to be a voice for and an advocate for destigmatizing, depathologizing. Sometimes I feel like I'm yelling into a chasm, and I'm also joined by lots of wonderful people. If you listen to grievers and they actually are given the floor, which they should be, I learn so much, and it is such an amazing experience when those things are quieted, like that, like stigma. I am having an upcoming grief group in the fall, and There are some grief groups around. Not every person is appropriate for a group setting at particular times, etc. But that which I learned personally and professionally, that can be a really enriching experience that destigmatizes, depathologizes, and builds a little of that confidence to say, I can walk about this world, and it's not like the movie stars, but I can walk about this world finding my way in this journey versus destination.
Yeah, I definitely want to second that. I think those types of support groups can be, similar, again, another plug, similar to the peer support groups that we do at Nami to support people living with, myriads of mental health conditions. But those grief, loss support groups can be very beneficial, but it has to be the right group, right? Not everyone, can slot into each group. Everyone kind of has a different focus, and some people may not be ready. Last thing I want to touch on, because you mentioned signals answering that last question, and I thought that the way that you sort of categorized and listed all the different signals was like, I don't know, it was really cool for me to see them broken up in that way. And it got me curious, are there certain signals or like group of signals that you found in your counseling work respond especially well to that type of work, with someone trying to address grief and loss?
Well, I think if someone is in touch and in tune with their experience, and like I said, it's hard work. It's not easy to dissect or unpack these things. I don't pretend that it is, but it can be, and it can also be incredibly fear-inducing, because if I face that, I don't know what's on the other side. I don't know how I turn out on the other side, again, with that predictability picture. Some of the signals I would look for or think would be really well attuned is if someone, to be honest, has aspects of anger, and there's stigma involved with that. Like, why are you angry? You shouldn't. The shoulds come into play there. But I think when someone is self-aware and they are, you almost have to want to be in a spot of leaning in or befriending that. There is an aspect of curiosity and courage, and those show up when we are sometimes elevated, like anger, or when we are feeling so hopeless. And I know that might sound counterintuitive, but when someone feels so hopeless, like nobody's getting me, that's kind of the recipe for, but I'm ready to unpack what the heck is going on for me. I'm not necessarily able to find it in all those circles, inner or outer or whatever, perhaps. And I would say those would be a great recipe. It sounds counterintuitive, but it definitely motivates when you feel like, and part of the role of the person walking alongside is to kind of support, okay, you need to work on understanding what it is you're experiencing, right? I can't and should not tell you what that is. Many people have come and said, well, can you tell me where this is going to end and what it's going to look like? And I wish that I could. But do I have the skills to be able to support somebody kind of doing the personal unpacking and history? Yes, definitely. And that's a really great place to be. Being able to share, I've been honored to share space with people who also have had their own bit of I don't want to say revelations, but being able to reflect in a way that is not like any other space, because you are forever changed. It is transformative. And as much as, if you think about it, some of those signals, like that are more action oriented, that are drivers. I used anger because that's the one that's coming to mind most right now. But when you think about that, that energy, that active engagement, those create movement and change, which kind of goes back to what we in the Western part of the world are hoping for. I want to move through this. I want to get over it. I want to be done with it. But then there's the annoying voice of your companion over here that says, yes, and you'll also be carrying it with you.
So we did end up getting a question from the audience, and thank you for that answer. Ileana, from the, support, like someone who's supporting someone's side, so changing gears a little bit. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but it sounds like, they're wondering if it's a good idea or a bad idea to kind of like protect someone from confronting loss they've experienced. I think they're sort of thinking maybe they don't believe that they're strong enough in the present moment to confront it head on. I don't know. Do you have sort of a feel for, I know it might be person to person basis, but maybe you could just speak on that type of situation.
Well, and I think it's great and interesting using the word strong, how our vision of what that means. It's my hope to be able to encourage that the signals it sounds like the person might be having are things that are more reflective. I wouldn't say necessarily passive, but I would say it takes just as much energy to recognize and be self-aware that, yeah, I'm not looking to lean all the way in, but can I do it in doses? Can I do that dance that encounter it and step back and baby steps? It is slow and takes so much time. One of my mentors uses the phraseology, there's no reward for speed. I'm adding my own words. We don't get a graduation diploma at the end. It is slow. So it actually sounds like, as she's talking about that person, they're listening to themselves. And maybe as the supporter, they want to encourage, okay, maybe we could take a baby step. But again, I would lean into suggesting that the person does the trial and error. It's led by the person who's experienced the grief. And of course, if you have a certain kind of relationship with that person, being able to say, here's what I'm seeing. I want to support you dosing this in a way that is helpful for you. And I'm right here with you to test those waters, and creating a sense of safety. The trauma-informed way is that there's choice and there's voice, right? When we've been traumatized, everything feels out of control and we've had no choice in the matter. That can also freeze us or have us to be more hesitant to lean into that more difficult aspect. But giving somebody the offer to be right there with them and say, we can try it in small steps. Would you like to do that? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think thanks for answering that. And I think that you putting it in that dance metaphor makes it really, like, I don't know, it makes it easier for me to envision kind of how supporting someone or supporting yourself, can be really delicate and but worth it. And so yeah, I think I want to be respectful of everyone's time. You've taken us all the way to our 90-minute block here. So with that, Natalie, I'd love to thank you for this wonderful talk on grief and loss at our June monthly meeting for 2022. For those watching, thank you for sticking with us throughout this, for your questions, your comments. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and be on the lookout for our July monthly meeting to be announced soon. You can visit us at www.nami-northernvirginia.org. You can find Natalie and wonderful folks like Natalie at Sunstone Counseling. I forget the website exactly, but if you Google Sunstone Counseling, it'll come up. And yeah, oh, that's what you need right there. Sunstonecounselors.com. I knew I was almost right. But again, thank you all this evening for your attention and for your participation. We hope you learned something that you can take with you into your life. Until next time, have a great evening.